Is this on? Yeah, this is on. I don't think I need to be that close, do I? I'm Gary Klein, teach political science here at Georgia Southwestern. We're fortunate tonight to have three very highly qualified historians speaking to us about various topics related to Asia. First, let me make a few announcements. There are sign-up sheets going around, a couple of them, for Dr. Isaac's students. And so if you're one of his students, he wants you to get signed in at some point tonight before you leave. You may wonder why Dr. Isaacs is not here. Dr. Isaacs, as many of you know, is a professor emeritus of history at Georgia Southwestern, and a super teacher and a superhuman being. And he began this Third World Series back in 1981. This is actually the 30th anniversary of these programs that he's been doing every semester for 30 years. A lot of students and a lot of faculty have benefited from his efforts and from these programs that he's sponsored for so many years. Just a few years after he began these programs, he also founded the Association of Third World Studies, which is now the largest professional association for the study of third world issues in the United States. And it produces biannually a very fine journal, the Journal of Third World Studies, which Dr. Isaacs has edited for many years now. But he's not here tonight because his terrific wife, Doris, is in the hospital, and she is very seriously ill. And because of that, I'd like us maybe to spend just a few moments quietly meditating, if you would. Send Dr. Isaacs and Doris some good wishes right now, if you would, please. Okay, thank you. Well, I know we all wish him the best, and Doris. As I said, we've got three seasoned, very excellent historians on our program tonight, people that fine historians and fine people. I've worked with at least a couple of them. One's new to me, a couple of them for many years myself, in connection with the Association of Third World Studies. I want to welcome you all to the program. I'm not going to delay things too much, but we have right in front of me here Dr. James Gillum, who is professor of history at Spelman College, and his specialization is Chinese history. He is a Vietnam War veteran, and he's written a couple of books detailing his personal experiences from the war. And he will talk to us first. I'll say a little bit more about our other two speakers just before they speak. Dr. Bill Head over here to my right, your left, and Dr. Paul Rodell over here to my left, your right. So. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Jim Gillum. Dr. Gillum will speak to us. The topic of his talk tonight is the political and diplomatic preparation for the Cambodian invasion. Welcome, Dr. Gillum.
You know what? I might get my sticker right now.
Oh, it's just the shortcut.
Yeah.
You need them. Yeah.
I forgot we took,
Is mine in there?
yeah,
Here, give it.
there's another. Don't worry about it. See what happens when you get techno cripples?
Current slide.
Mm-hmm.
There you go.
Okay, I guess it's on and I'm heard now, right? You can hear me? Okay. In the late winter and spring of 1970, American foreign policy in Southeast Asia was on a clearly marked course away from the escalation policy that had been the hallmark of the Lyndon Johnson administration. At that time, in the late winter and early spring of 1970, Vietnamization was which was going to be the hallmark of the Nixon administration, was underway. The reason for the change was the Tet Offensive of 1968. I don't have time to go into all of that, but just let me say this about that event. The Tet Offensive of 1968 prompted Lyndon Johnson to effectively resign from the presidency in March of 1968. And there was an election campaign that year that effectively brought Nixon to the White House. And in some ways, his election was a referendum on this policy change. It was a referendum and a statement by the American public to bring the troops out of Vietnam. The basic ideas for the Vietnamization policy are right here. Get the American troops home, leave the Saigon government, our ally, with a chance for victory after America left. And to do that was going to have to, the president realized he was going to have to widen the war, at least temporarily, okay? In July of 1969, there were clear indications that Nixon had started to implement Vietnamization. For example, he met with South Vietnam's president, Nguyen Van Thieu, at Midway Island. At the end of the Midway Conference, there was an announcement that there would be a, quote, redeployment of 25,000 American soldiers from the war. A few days later, about that same time, General Creighton Abrams, the American commander in Vietnam, announced a specific plan to withdraw the 3rd Battalion, 66th Brigade, and of the 9th Infantry Division, and another Marine Division from Vietnam. This plan was called Operation Keystone Eagle. Both of those withdrawals were symptomatic of the problems with Vietnamization from the American side. What was going on here, what the problem was, is how do you get American troops out of the war without leaving our allies in an uncomfortable position? And also, how do you announce the withdrawal of fighting troops from a war without giving the advantage to the other side? That was the heart of the problem with with Vietnamization. Plus, you had a large element of the American population and the American Congress that wanted the troops out of Vietnam right away. Just get them home, get somebody on a plane and get home. Okay. Nixon had promised to bring the guys home because that was part of the election campaign. So to countenance widening our involvement there for any reason was a major complication in Vietnam, in the Vietnam policy. Why I'm talking, keep mentioning widening the war, everyone understood that to get America out and achieve number 2 on the list here, we would have to cross the border, go to Cambodia, and destroy the sanctuaries, supply depots, hospitals, rest areas, etc., that were in Cambodia right next to Vietnam. So Nixon had won the presidency, that was his job, and the complicated step of widening the war, at least temporarily, invading Cambodia, if you will, was taken in the spring of 1970 when elements of both the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the ARVN troops, and American units swept into Cambodia between April and June of 1970. One of the American units that went to Cambodia was called the 2nd Field Force Vietnam, and it was authorized to penetrate up to 30 kilometers into Cambodia. I was a staff sergeant in one of the units that made up the 2nd Field Force Vietnam, so I participated in the invasion of Cambodia that summer. What follows is my analysis of the invasion from not the personal ground-up perspective, but from a larger historical one. The Cambodian government's goals in the drama that was shaped that spring and summer, there were only 3 of them, really. Cambodia, the first goal was to complete a change of administration in order to remove the men loyal to their prince, Norodom Sihanouk, from power. A related but somewhat separate goal was the settlement of court politics and family rivalry that was left over from the time when the French government placed Sihanouk in power. Sirik Matak, the prince's cousin, was a power behind the throne and angry at his cousin because he had not been chosen to lead Cambodia. The last goal for the Cambodians, Sihanouk supporters or not, was to find a neutral place in the ever-expanding war in Southeast Asia. While the Cambodians pursued their political, dynastic, and diplomatic objectives, the leaders in Hanoi and Saigon also had things they wanted to get done. Obviously, each of them wanted to win their side of the war in Vietnam, yet their pursuit of victory became inextricably tied to events in Cambodia. The complications began when America escalated its presence in the south of Vietnam during the Johnson era, and Hanoi responded by bringing their troops and supplies into the southern part of Vietnam by way of Cambodia. They just came south, took a hard right into Cambodia, came down to the central highlands of Vietnam, and unloaded their troops and men into the war. Hanoi's objective was one of Hanoi's objectives was to protect that supply infrastructure known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Second objective was to support the Khmer Rouge movement in Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge were Hanoi's agents of revolution inside Cambodia. It was their, they were patrons of the Hanoi government, and also the Khmer Rouge and Hanoi both wanted to destabilize the Cambodian government. As long as Sihanouk's regime was unstable, they knew they could do what they wanted to inside Cambodia. Saigon's goals, first of all, victory over Hanoi, right? The next one is continue the alliance with the United States of America because we supplied them with just about everything they needed: arms, ammunition, uniforms, food, training, helicopters, artillery. Without us, they're kind of sunk. Next thing, destroy the sanctuaries in Cambodia. It stands to reason that if the NVA, the National Liberation Forces, the forces of Hanoi, whatever you want to call them, if they have no supply depots, they have no hospitals for rest and recuperation, if they have no supplies, etc., then the boys in Saigon are going to stand a better chance when America leaves the field of battle. The other thing is Saigon had some generals, some field-grade officers and company-grade officers who were determined to pursue historic and ethnic antagonisms between Cambodians and the Vietnamese. Vietnam was not always the same shaped country that you see on the map now. It used to be confined to the northern part of what is now Vietnam, the Red River Delta. From the 14th to the 17th century, the Vietnamese kind of exploded out of the Red River Delta, moved southward, and they drove the temporarily weakened Cham and Khmer kingdoms westward into the areas that we now call Cambodia. There was a lot of unhappiness and antagonism in that process, and the anger was still there in 1970. The last player on the stage that summer were the Americans, and simply put, they wanted to exit Southeast Asia with positive political, diplomatic, and strategic position. They wanted to get out of the war, but save face. Kind of interesting to have an American government concerned with such an Asian concept as face. The Cambodian effort to change their administration and solve their familial and dynastic issues began during the critical period 1966 to 70. National elections were going on then. The whole period was really characterized by economic distress and political chaos. It was also a time when Prince Sihanouk, the nation's ruler, frequently retreated to the Côte d'Azur in France. In his absence, General Lon Nol began serving as prime minister from 1966 onward, and he joined with Sirek Matak, Sihanouk's cousin, to fill the void in leadership every time Sihanouk left the country. They pursued their own personal and political goals. For example, Matak, the first deputy premier, had long hated his cousin. So both Matak and Lon Nol were also angered by the presence of Vietnamese sanctuaries in Cambodia, and they did what they could to make sure that the Vietnamese stopped this really hateful practice of diverting and stealing rice crops from the Cambodians to feed the NVA in their sanctuaries. After their electoral success in 1966, Lon Nol and Sirek Matak spent much of 67 and 68 replacing Sihanouk loyalists with their own men in government. In 1967, the Nol-Matak coalition tried to make serious efforts to end the diversion of rice to communists in the rural areas of Battambang province and the city of Samlat. The result was a wave of violence between Cambodians and those who backed Hanoi and the Khmer Rouge. The Khmer resorted to ambushes and peasant roundups and the murders that spread from Samlat to almost every corner of the country. In the wake of the spreading violence, Lon Nol himself resigned and went to France briefly, but he came back. During the crisis years of 66 to 70, Sihanouk continued to avoid his own responsibilities, and the violence spread across from Battambang to Samlat, and he went back to the Côte d'Azur to make a movie and to lose weight at a health stop. After those priorities were taken care of, he made a belated trip to Moscow in hopes of getting the Soviet Union to restrain the Viet and Khmer communists. He got no help. The best he did at that time for his people, and it was seen as little indeed, was to order Lan Nol and Matak to recall the counterfeit 500 Riem notes that the Vietnamese and Khmer Rouge were using to buy rice. Sihanouk remained abroad, and the Nol Matak coalition did what they could to present nationalistic responses to the Vietnamese presence. For example, in January and February of 1970, the Cambodian army shelled Viet sanctuaries, and in March, civilians with government approval began to hold mass demonstrations against the Vietnamese in Cambodia. On March 11 of that year, protesters actually sacked the Vietnamese embassy and in the process discovered plans for a Vietnamese coup to seize control of all of Cambodia. Lon Nol issued an apology for sacking the embassy, but he also issued an ultimatum giving the Vietnamese 3 days to leave Cambodia. When those plans were discovered, Sihanouk was en route from Moscow to Beijing to seek the help of the Chinese communists, the other dominant communist force at that time, in restraining the people inside his country. Lan Nol heard about the coup plans when he was driven to the airport. And then there was a second coup, not by the Vietnamese, but by Lan Nol and Sirek Matok. They ousted Sihanouk from power in a so-called bloodless coup. It wasn't all that bloodless. In Beijing, Sihanouk conferred with Zhou Enlai, the Chinese foreign minister, about regaining his position in his own country and getting the Vietnamese out. Zhou Enlai convinced Sihanouk that the best thing to do would to form an alliance of Vietnamese and Cambodians called the Front Uninational Kampuchea. The acronym is FUNK. The creation of FUNK guaranteed Sihanouk's failure. Its Vietnamese element was mostly Viet Minh insurgents who had just been driven from Cambodia by Lan Nol. There were also two Cambodian components in FUNK. One was made up of moderate Cambodian intellectuals. They hoped to use their Sihanouk affiliation to get their jobs back. The moderates were the ones who had been displaced by Lan Nol and Sirek Matok. There was another die-hard communist element in FUNK. It was headed by a man named Pol Pot, a former member of the colonial elite. Pol Pot eventually overcame all the elements in FUNK, and we know now that he established a murderous regime that rivaled that of Adolf Hitler. While Sihanouk was in Beijing trying to get his political fortunes restored, Lan Nol continued the effort to rid Cambodia of the Vietnamese. In doing so, he created the situation that drew South Vietnamese and American armies across the border into Vietnam. The proximate events that made that happen was, first of all, the March 11 discovery and then the 72-hour deadline. And when the North Vietnamese remained inside Cambodia, the Cambodian army began attacking Vietnamese sanctuaries. Their attacks were supported by the ARVN artillery, the forces of Saigon. Then in the next 10 days, from March 17 to March 27, ARVN ground forces moved to within 1.5 miles of Cambodia. Then they sent short-range patrols across the border. And they also used air and artillery support from American units on the border. In the spring of 1970, there were 400,000 400,000 Vietnamese in Cambodia. There were out of 7 million people. 75% of those Vietnamese were pro-Hanoi. So when ARVN began active support of the Cambodian army, Lon Nol's troops committed a series of ethnic massacres against the Vietnamese across the country. The two largest were incidents on April 17, when an estimated 1,000 Vietnamese bodies were seen floating in the Mekong River, kind of a symbolic sending the Vietnamese back downstream to Vietnam. Another incident, there was 100 people reported killed in the town of Thieu. 2 days later, in the town of Prasivat, another 89 Vietnamese were killed. So, ethnic cleansing, Vietnamese style, Cambodian style, began in 1970. The Cambodian army actually did pretty well against Vietnamese civilians, but when they met the NVA and the Khmer Rouge, things were decidedly different. Did I go backwards? No, I didn't. Okay, I should have put that slide up before. Sorry about that. Okay, Saigon crosses the border, right? The first ARVN forces that arrived in Cambodia came around April 14th and between April 14th and 17th. They were company and battalion-sized elements drawn from Saigon's armored cavalry, infantry, and ranger units. Then on April 29, Saigon committed this massive group called the 2nd Field Force Vietnam to the fight, and they moved about as far as 30 kilometers, maybe a little more, into Cambodia. This was a division-sized unit composed of several battalions of tanks, armored cavalry, conventional infantry troops. It was based at Chau Dak in the western part of South Vietnam's Third Corps area. That's basically southwest Vietnam. They had originally taken up positions there as American 1st Infantry Division troops were withdrawn as part of the Vietnamization program. The 2nd Field Force Vietnam was ARVN's best and most experienced troops. Their mission was to locate and destroy NVA sanctuaries known as Base Areas 367 and 706. That assignment represented a major shift in regional strategy and policies at that time. 367 and 706 were base camps that supported Hanoi in the effort to defeat Saigon in the area right around Thieu's capital in Saigon. Until 1970, neither Washington nor Saigon had sent major units of troops in pursuit of those two places. They had relied on clandestine missions by small units and then secret bombing of the area by America's strategic forces called Arclight missions. So when the 2nd Field Force V moved across the border, the Cambodian had its official start in April of 1970. When the large-scale fighting began in April, Lon Nol was not prepared. He had 35,000 men under arms and a call-up for 10,000 more. 6 weeks later, he had 150,000 unarmed soldiers, unarmed volunteers. He had an air force of 40 planes. Most of them were grounded for lack of spare parts. Is it time? Okay. Nixon. What was Nixon doing? Nixon was trying to support Nguyen, but he was trying to avoid the use of the I word, the invasion word. Arms, ammunition, troops, clandestine support, all of that is going into into Cambodia as early as April. Problem here, the president is not informing Congress. They're upset. They sent 2 diplomats to find out what's going on. John Moose and Robert Lowenstein, the Lowenstein Moose Mission. They found evidence. I'll give you one funny story and then I'll sit down. Lowenstein and Moose tracked down documents and interviewed officials who were helping with the invasion before we were allowed to officially get involved. The American naval attaché military attaché in Phnom Penh, the capital, would not cooperate, so they hunted him up on his lunch break on the street. And he guaranteed them there's no Americans in Cambodia, no Air Force, no artillery, no soldiers. While they had that conversation, a helicopter with American markings hovered over the intersection. So no one was willing to use the I word until actually about June of 1970. And I'll answer questions about that later, okay? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gillum. Our next speaker is Dr. Bill Head, who is the chief historian at Warner Robins Air Logistics Center over in Warner Robins, Georgia. He's an expert on U.S. foreign policy in Southeast Asia, has written numerous books, and he also served as president of the Association of Third World Studies. I'll mention that. He will talk to us about the Mayaguez incident, final tragedy of the U.S. involvement in the Second Indochina War. Dr. Head.
All right, if Jim was a technically challenged, I'm a dinosaur when it comes to this stuff. Yeah, help me out.
First of all,
You know,
is this?
The problem is, I work for the Air Force, and when I go do a briefing to a bunch of colonels, I give it Greg Apple and sticks it in, and I just punch buttons. So I don't know how it actually works.
Now, is this yours?
It is.
Yes.
You did good. You know which gets me forward. Just push that one.
How do you go forward and backward?
Right arrow goes forward. Here we go. Okay.
That's
All right, well, get me back. There we go. Perfect.
that's your
I
start.
did good.
Okay. So I didn't know what your start was.
All
So
right.
then this one to go forward, this one to go back.
All right. Now, the reason I'm going second is because what I'm going to talk about dovetails what Dr. Gillum talked about. What he didn't have a chance to talk about was the fact that this was the prepositioning of ARVN troops before they actually executed a plan called Lam Sam 719, which was an attack into Cambodia by 17,000 South Vietnamese troops supported by U.S. artillery and air power. That included Army helicopters. It was a disaster. What they ran into with 24,000 of the best PAVN, or NVA, communist North Vietnamese troops. On top of all of that, it caused a new wave of protests in the United States. In fact, I still remember being part of one in Tallahassee, Florida, at Florida State, in which at a time when many of us didn't really care so much what was going on in Vietnam, we were kind of becoming apathetic, but boy, did this charge us back up. So it is, in a sense, as a good friend of mine, Thieu, who was the last South Vietnamese ambassador to the United States, once said, he said it was the beginning of the end, or the end of the beginning, whichever you prefer. Now, almost 5 years later, the United States had pulled its troops, basically all of its troops out. Vietnamization had occurred. President Nixon had resigned office in '74 and been replaced by President Gerald Ford. Now, normally I don't read papers. I don't like to do that. But I'm going to do this so I can keep to the time limit, if you don't mind. Okay. On 12 April 1975, the Khmer Rouge seized Cambodia, and within 3 weeks, North Vietnamese forces had overrun South Vietnam. But as the U.S. abandoned their decade-long commitment to a conflict which many, in hindsight, believe they may not have ever had a real chance to win, events in the waters off Cambodia drew them back to the Southeast Asia just one more time. The incident began on 12 May 1975, when Cambodian Communist naval forces operating former, and what you see in front of you is a swift boat with Americans on it, but the Cambodian Navy had captured those swift boats when we pulled out, and they were using them against us. They seized the container ship SS Mayaguez, which was flying an American flag. I hope this goes forward. There we go. It was in international waters, and as the Cambodians attacked the ship, the radio operator sent out a Mayday signal, which was picked up by U.S. vessels and aircraft. Once on board the Mayaguez, the Khmer Rouge accused the crew of spying, and they subjected them to what euphemistically was called intense interrogation. They tortured them. Their favorite torture, which Jim knows all too well, was to pop their shoulders out of joint. That was a real good one they liked to use. As this transpired, U.S. surveillance aircraft began searching for the 30-year-old container ship, and they soon discovered it had been moved to Koh Tong Island, 50 miles off the southern coast of Cambodia. Now, I put this map up because it'll give you a reference point of where Cambodia is, and in that little square, you will see Koh Tong Island, which is off the coast of Cambodia. The information was quickly sent to Washington, and it hit the Ford administration like a lightning bolt from heaven. Already devastated by the fall of Saigon just 2 weeks earlier, they were confronted by yet another potentially humiliating incident they feared might further damage the nation's reputation. Having been president for only 10 months and having not been elected president, Gerald Ford believed that he had to act decisively, and in his opinion, he needed to use military force. Some later, of course, have accused him of acting impetuously, since U.S. forces were scattered all over the Pacific on their way home from Southeast Asia. Ford believed he had few other options, however, since the U.S. had no formal diplomatic relations with the Cambodian regime. So calling the seizure piracy, he ordered American forces to retake the ship and the 40-man crew. The first steps in retaking the ship came when the aircraft carrier USS Coral Sea was redirected to the waters near Cambodia. In addition, 600 Marines were repositioned from Okinawa, Japan, and the Philippines to Utapao Royal Thai Air Force Base in Thailand on 14 May 1975. And I might add, without the express permission of the Thai government. The previous day, 16 Air Force CH-53 Sea Stallions and HH-53 Super Jolly Green Giant helicopters of the 40th Air Rescue and Recovery Squadron and the 21st Special Operations Squadron in Thailand have been designated for the rescue operation. In turn, President Ford directed the 7th Air Force to keep an eye on the Mayaguez and prevent the Khmer Rouge from moving the crew to Kampong Som, which is on the mainland, from which rescue would be nearly impossible. Early on the 14th, F-111A fighter bombers from the 347th Tactical Fighter Wing, based at Korat Royal Thai Air Force Base, located the Mayaguez. It was being towed, or escorted and towed, by 4 enemy gunboats. AC-130 fixed-wing gunships were ordered to shadow the 4 gunboats and fire across the bows to prevent them from reaching the coast. The Spectres, 40mm cannon, and 105 howitzers forced 3 of the gunboats to turn back. and that's an F4D, and this is an A7D, and the reason I'm bring those up you'll see in just a second. Flights of F-111s, which you've already seen, the F-4Ds, A-7D fighter bombers fired in front of the remaining ship, hoping it would turn back. But when it didn't, one of the A-7Ds sank it. Soon after, a wooden fishing boat also departed for Kotong Island. The U.S. air crews now were afraid that on this ship might be the crew of the Mayaguez. As it turns out, they were right. Initial orders were for them to do the same thing to this ship, fire across the bow of the ship, force it to turn back. It never did. It kept going on to the mainland. But they couldn't verify whether the crew was on there at the time, and so military planners assumed, y'all know what assume does, they assumed that the crew was still on Kotong Island. And so they based the entire operation on that fact. Mission planners expected the rescue to be a low-intensity operation. But since intelligence was sparse and planning time was short, the plan soon took on a very haphazard nature. As it turned out, the Marine units and helicopter crews scheduled to attack Kotong were unaware that the island was defended by these guys, elite Khmer Rouge naval infantry forces, Marines. The U.S. forces expected 35 to 40 lightly armed militia. Instead, they found a reinforced battalion of 800 to 1,000 men, some of their best troops, I might add. With little time to plan, what was needed most likely was a simple, straightforward operation. Even back-channel diplomacy probably would have been better. Instead, the military plan evolved into a hastily created mission based on an overly complicated plan. A unit of 57 Marines was sent in 3 helicopters to the destroyer escort USS Holt to board the Mayaguez. Another force of 600 Marines, which I've already mentioned, in 8 helicopters attacking in 4 different directions, were ordered to seize and hold Kotong Island. 2 other CH-53s were to act as search and rescue helicopters, supported by, and that's the Henry B. Wilson, which is one of the ships they're going to use in the operation. And I've gotten past myself here. They were supported by an HC-130 command and control aircraft. Planners assigned the guided missile destroyer USS Wilson to support the Kotong operation. You saw the Wilson. And the frigate USS Schofield. It was placed in the waters between Kotong and the mainland in order to keep the Khmer Rouge from sending reinforcements. Concurrently, carrier aircraft from the Coral Sea were supposed to attack targets in Cambodia to keep them busy so they couldn't support the Khmer Rouge on Kotong Island. At 0600 on 15 May, the operation began with a transfer of the Marines to the Holt. And here you see the Holt and the Mayaguez. At 0700, the destroyer escort came alongside as A-7 aircraft poured down canisters of tear gas on the Mayaguez. And there you see the gas mask of the guys going on the ship to capture it. The fight for the ship took 50 minutes, and it was very intense, even though the Marines had only a few wounded and no one killed in the situation. To their great consternation, what they discovered was the crew wasn't there. Now they had to figure out where they were. Were they on Kotong Island or not? As this transpired, 5 CH-53s and 3 HH-53s attacked Kotong Island, both on the east and west beach, encountering unexpectedly heavy fire. Some from rocket-propelled grenades, and these are the guys landing on the island. One CH-53 crash landed on the east beach. Its 20 Marines and crew of 5 survived. They quickly established a defensive perimeter, but they remained isolated throughout the operation. And this is a picture of the RPGs I just mentioned. And here are the guys kind of hunkering down around the helicopters to keep from getting killed after they crash landed. Soon after the first CH-53s went down, a second was shot down by 2 RPGs. It crashed just off shore where the pilot, 5 Marines, and 2 Navy corpsmen were killed. Let's see, I think I've got it. Yeah. Here's a picture of one of those helicopters that crashed. It's actually out in the water. You can see the coastline there. Another Marine drowned swimming from the wreckage, and 3 Marines were killed by gunfire trying to reach the beach. 10th Marine died of his wounds while clinging to the burning wreckage. The surviving 10 Marines and 3 Air Force crew members had to tread water for 4 hours before they were picked up by the Wilson, which courageously came close inland and risked running ashore in order to save the men that were shot down. On the West Beach, 2 other CH-53s arrived at 0630. Things went well at first, but as soon as the Marines began to offload, they came under equally intense fire. After some frantic repair efforts, one of the choppers was able to take off again, even though it had been hit in the engine. It was covered by suppressing fire from the second CH-53. Billowing smoke, the first CH-53 flew out to sea and was able to ditch a mile offshore, where all but 1 crew member was rescued. Soon the enemy damaged the second CH-53 so severely that it turned back with its Marines, including the company commander, and was forced to crash land on the Thai coast, where all on board were eventually saved. The 4 helicopters of the 2 remaining sections of the first wave eventually landed all of their Marines between 0630 and 0930. Here's the making an emergency landing. Here we go. They were supported by withering fire from an AC-130H gunship of the 16th Special Operations Squadron. Acting extemporaneously, the Spectre was literally able to cut a path through the enemy positions and escort the helicopters to their landing area to unload the Marines. Close air support had begun to improve as AC-130 Spectre number 61, that's their call sign, arrived overhead. The pilot identified himself to the pinned down Marines and fired several spotting rounds, one of which hit an enemy bunker. And he said, "How was that, guys?" And the AC-130 spotter replied, "Right on. It didn't do much." This is not the AC-130 spotter. This is the Marines on the ground, excuse me. "Right on, it didn't do much," the Marine gunnery sergeant replied. Then the Spectre fired a 105 round, which demolished another bunker. "Jesus Christ," the Marine exclaimed. "What was that, man? Boy, do I have targets for you." The firepower from the Spectre 61 and her sister gunships enabled the 2 groups of Marines to finally join forces and help them survive this harrowing experience. As the 130 Marines on the West and East Beaches pressed their assault, they continued to meet heavy resistance. Only fire support from numerous mortars, as well as close air support, allowed them to carry on. Of the 8 helicopters assaulting Koh Tong, 3 had been destroyed and 4 others were severely damaged. One of the 3 choppers employed in the Holt portion of the operation had also been severely damaged, attempting to pick up the platoon isolated on East Beach. This left only 3 helicopters of the original 11 available to bring in reinforcements. These reinforcements left Utapao around 0900. But the cruel irony of all this was that the crew of the Mayaguez had already been released. The crew members were all alive and in pretty good health, and were found floating at sea on a fishing boat, subsequently were transferred to the Holt. With word of the ship's rescue, the Joint Chiefs, and this, by the way, you see what the title is, they're getting word at that meeting of the rescue. The Joint Chiefs decided, okay, we got him, let's go home. The only problem is we still got a couple hundred Marines stuck on Koh Tong Island. Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth Austin, ground commander at Koh Tong, soon made it clear that additional troops were necessary to prevent his forces from being overrun. And so the second wave was sent in. Eventually, as they were bringing in those Marines, they were able to evacuate the wounded. There were 225 Marines and 5 airmen now left on Koh Tong. Now came the evacuation. Supported by AC-130s and mortar fire, the evacuation of these Marines began around noon, and it continued under heavy fire most of the day and the afternoon and evening. Here they are getting back in the helicopters and getting them off. The process proved agonizingly slow. Each time the helicopter picked up a group of Marines, it was required for an AC-130 to escort the 30 to 50 Marines. The helicopter was carried back to the Coral Sea. And here's another group of them evacuating. As the troops withdrew, the Marines had to contract their perimeter. They carefully supervised redeployment of their remnant each time to ensure that no one was missing. You know, the whole Semper Fi thing, we don't leave our guys behind. In spite of all of that, and in spite of a great deal of heroism on the part of every Marine on the ground, yeah, I got you. They finally got the last guys out in pitch black under heavy fire at about 10 o'clock. 3 guys were accidentally left behind. Altogether, 14 Marines were killed, 2 Navy corpsmen were killed, 2 airmen were killed, and later officials discovered that in a training or preparatory flight, even before the operation began, 23 other airmen were killed. This raised the final death toll of Americans to 41. Marines had lost 35, the Air Force 6. The Khmer Rouge had lost 65 to 70 killed, while estimates determined that they had twice that many wounded. All those killed, except for the Marine who drowned, were eventually brought back. Now, about those 3 that were left, and I'm going to jump over several pages here. The fact is that they were probably dead when the final group came out. And today they are officially recorded that way. But there are a lot of people, as you might imagine, who do not believe that. And in fact, many believe that the Khmer Rouge captured them, tortured them, and killed them. Marines who participated in the operation were critical of the ad hoc nature of the joint operation and blamed pressure from the Ford White House for the hastily constructed plan that they believed was designed only to save a loss of face for the loss of Vietnam. Indeed, frustration was also rife within the White House itself. Not long afterward, a chagrined Henry Kissinger admitted privately that, quote, "We entered Indochina to save a country and ended by rescuing a ship." Of course, Ford is an easy target, but as he pointed out years later, given the timing of the events, he believed he had no practical choice but to take decisive military action as quickly as possible. If he had not, he might in hindsight have wound up with a PR mess that Jimmy Carter did in Iran, or the disaster in Grenada and other places that took place later. And I can wrap this up very quickly by simply saying that the public supported the idea, and so did most of the people in the government did as well. As you can see on Time magazine, President Ford got a lot of support by the American public, including the media, which many people didn't believe supported the war. Let me finish. I got 2 paragraphs in, and I'll be done. In May 1975, the U.S. military, frankly, was not prepared to carry out a rescue and military operation of the kind that was necessary for Mayaguez. To quote Vice Admiral George P. Steele, the 7th Fleet commander, "The sad part of the Mayaguez is that we had sufficient forces coming up with the 7th Fleet after it had been turned around from its evacuation of Vietnam to seize southern Cambodia. I begged for another day or 2 rather than commit forces piecemeal as we did. The idea that we could use the U.S. Air Force, Air Police, and Air Force helicopters as assault forces appears to me as ridiculous today as it did then. And in conclusion, while it's easy to blame the president or the whatever, the fact is ultimately, the Mayaguez remains a footnote in the history of the Vietnam War. The desire of a nation to distance itself from the Vietnam debacle had much to do with that. The final paradox is that the Mayaguez affair was technically a success, as it did recover the container ship and its crew. It defined the Ford presidency until his death in 2006. Ford pointed to the mission frequently as having saved America's pride and reputation. But it came at a terrible price. And in the end, it was, in my mind, the last tragedy of a decade-long tragedy on the mainland of Southeast Asia. And the proof of that is at the wall in Washington, D.C. Thank you.
Sorry, I meant to get rid of that.
Thank you, Dr. Head. Our final speaker for the night is Dr. Paul Rodell. Paul, we want to thank your parole officer also for letting you out of Statesboro today. He teaches history at Georgia Southern, and as a boy he volunteered for the Peace Corps and served in the Philippines. Dr. Rodell's topic is John Nofziger and the Philippine colonial origins of the U.S. Peace Corps.
Now I got to plug this one in here.
Okay.
Well, I can take yours out, but I'd rather do it safely. So let me just.
He has experience doing this.
No, I don't want changes. I'll just pull your thing out here. Which one are you? Jeez.
I'm red.
F?
This one right here.
Hang on. Just to be sure, I'll knock them both out. Get letter E too. Now you're good to go. This is Jim's.
Great.
Alrighty. You've been a good audience. You've been hanging with things. Am I too loud here now for you? Am I waking you up? Would you rather go back to sleep? I'll stand a little bit further away and lean up against the wall. You can see a real contrast between the three of us. First guy gets up, he's from Atlanta, coat and tie. Then our man from Warner Robins, shirt and tie. Here I am in my plaid shirt. So that's me. Okay, I suppose I should pop this thing up here. And let's see, Nofziger, I'm the third one here. There we go. Now, let's get this up, make it full. Well, yeah, it's on that already. Boom. Okay. 50th anniversary this year of the U.S. Peace Corps. 1961. So for us Peace Corpses, my foster family, the mother of the family, said, "Oh, Peace Corps." And the father said, "No, he's not corpse, he's still alive." Anyway, announced in 1961, and the general run-of-the-mill opinion of how did this thing come into being is, of course, with John F. Kennedy and the election of 1960, the need to win that election and to gather as much goodwill as possible, and to do so by announcing this heretofore unheard of idea that had normally been called, when they were talking about it, a youth corps, and maybe attract some voters and push him over the edge because it was a close race and he wasn't sure that he was going to win. All the good public relations he could gather, he needed. And In fact, it's been said, I grew up in Illinois, that a lot of the tombstones and cemeteries in Chicago voted. That may have been the case. A few years ago, I was interviewing people on a completely different topic, and it was about another voluntary organization called the International Voluntary Services. And I had interviewed a bunch of people and got to know some of them, not just as interviewees, but as friends I liked. I went on one visit up to D.C., where I'd interviewed one guy. I got together with him again, and he mentioned the founding executive director of that organization, who he said not only was, instrumental in building up his organization, I'll describe it in just a little bit, but that guy said that when he was a young man, he actually was a teacher in the Philippines, and he taught English. And it suddenly hit me, my God, I know what that guy was. He was a Thomasite. What the heck is that? Well, that's what I'm going to explain. Because there was a direct connection that I found out, thanks to this guy, Bob Mennick, who finally put the pieces together, between American colonial policy in the Philippines in 1901 and then the U.S. Peace Corps later. Let me explain. This guy, John S. Knopfsinger, I left all my notes. Oh, here they are. Was born in Ohio in 1886. And he was, and this is somewhat important, he was a member of one of the peace churches. And when I say peace churches, Quakers, Mennonites, Brethren. He was Church of the Brethren. And was raised in that ethic of peace and goodwill rather than any kind of war or aggression. And one of the things that involves certainly his church, and I believe all of the three of them, is a component of their religion is service to mankind. And when he was a young man, he was in college in Illinois, in Mount Morris College, and he heard about this program to send young Americans to the Philippines to teach. Now that program, he heard about it later. He learned about it in 1909, but the program started in 1901. 1901. In 1901, the United States was in the Philippines, but it wasn't yet in control. It was still fighting to gain control. The Philippine people had resisted the entrance of American troops. We had defeated the Spaniards like that. But the Filipinos had their own government, and they weren't allowing the United States to come in. So we were still wrapping things up. There were fights going on all over the country. Young Americans were recruited to teach. You could almost look on this as an early kind of counterinsurgency move to win the hearts and minds of the people. Teach them English, start schools, bring over young Americans to go out into the field. By 1909, he heard about it and decided to take the little Foreign Service civil service exam to become one of these teachers. And he did pass. He passed very well. He went through some training. They sent him over. And, oh, by the way, here is a picture of the ship that brought the largest group of these teachers in 1901. You'll notice that it's the USS Thomas, excuse me. So from that point on, from 1901 onward, any American who was coming over to teach in the schools was called a Thomasite. Even Knopfsinger, who came in 1910, was still called a Thomasite. But this ship had like close to 500 young men and women. And this really surprised the Philippine people. Like these were not people with guns. They were people in civilian clothes with books who were going out, in the provinces to teach and to bring about a new existence, a brighter day for Filipinos. So it really was kind of part of the winning hearts and minds of that era. Here's a picture of him. He is the guy in the beard, standing to your right, not the last guy, but the next to the last guy. He's entertaining some other friends. The couple seated all the way on the right, they were in the same province as he was. His province, Nueva Vizcaya, you go north of Manila to get there, and he had to take, first of all, a train until the train tracks ran out. Then he had to take a horse-drawn cart for a few miles more, another day's worth of travel, and then got a pack mule to go over the mountains to reach his place. He was there for 2 years, and his teaching and his life was like this. For 1 year, he got $1,200. He had to live in the village. He had to learn the local language. In turn, he spoke, he taught English. He taught Filipino students in the morning. He taught Filipino teachers in the afternoon. He held evening classes for adult education. And then he also traveled around checking on the schools. The second year, he became the district superintendent. He did his 2 years, thought about staying later, but decided, well, you know, here I am. I'm enjoying this nice life, but, well, you know, I miss my fiance. So he decided, I'll go home and I'll get married. He continued his life, you know, as a regular citizen, but he did go on and get a PhD in education. He worked with the Carnegie Foundation in education, mostly vocational education. And he served for, you know, a number of years in a number of vocational education activities, until finally, by 1953, he said, enough, I'm going to retire. Not a bad idea. All of us, I guess, maybe sooner or later want to retire. I forget what my next slide is. Let me see. Yes. In 1953, he was going to retire, but he didn't. Because the organization that I originally started off studying, I got to follow my notes here, the International Voluntary Services was begun in that year, and they soon realized that they needed somebody to run their organization in a professional way. They needed an executive director. One of the people who went out, and the International Voluntary Services, I should mention, what was it? Well, it was an organization set up by the peace churches. That's why his original religious affiliation as a young man in the Church of the Brethren is important, because the Quakers, Mennonites, and Brethren got together to form this organization. As far as their young men are concerned, the Quakers and Mennonites and Brethren don't want to serve in the active military. And they get a buy out of that because of their religious affiliation. But they have to do what is called alternative service in lieu of the military service. And this can take many forms. Oftentimes it's as a volunteer in a hospital, like emptying bedpans and other things such as that, or working with criminals and the like. These folks decided, let's get an organization for our young men that can give them something better than just emptying bedpans in a hospital. Let's give them some way to take their skills they've gotten and apply them to the world. Let's send them out for world service. Let's take them from their agricultural colleges and from their farms and bring them to Jordan, to Iraq, where the first groups were sent, and to other places as well. Get them out into the world. And how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to have to find somebody who's got the organizational skills. 2 members of the first founding board of IVS were charged with finding an executive director, and one of them happened to be Church of the Brethren, a man named Harold Rowe, and said, I know this guy who just retired. He'd be great. They hired him immediately. They had lunch with him and they said, he's our man. And they took him on. Knopfsinger headed up that organization from 1953 when it was founded, shortly after. Actually, he really came in on January 1st, 1954, so maybe this is a little bit wrong. But in any case, he headed it up and he expanded the programs. They had programs in about 11 or 12 different countries. By 1961, they had a number of volunteers who were in, Ghana in Africa, in Laos, in Vietnam. They were in a couple of other countries nowhere in Latin America, a couple of other countries in the Middle East. They had worked in cooperation with other agencies and private corporations like Aramco, Arab American oil company in Saudi Arabia, helped support their programs, sending volunteers out, etc., etc., etc. Here's a picture of him in later life, when he was still executive director of IVS. He was also active in other things too. Here he is, this National Service Board of Religious Objectors, and he's with some other people, and other Brethren, Mennonites, Quakers, in some of their meetings too. But 1960, now 1961, now he's already way beyond normal retirement time. And, times are changing. It's about time for him to retire. So he decides to leave IVS. But he doesn't really retire. He goes on to other things. Because he also was listening to Kennedy and to this whole idea of a youth corps to be called Peace Corps. I've got to get involved in this. And as soon as Kennedy was elected, and even even before the Peace Corps is actually formed, Knopfsinger writes to Kennedy, but actually sends this letter. This is from the U.S. National Archives in Washington. Well, actually, in not College Park. It's anyway outside of D.C. We're trying to remember it.
It's in southern Maryland.
It's in southern Maryland, yeah. I'm showing you this letter because this is interesting. The letter was actually, it's dated February 13, but it was really written on the 11th because the envelope that it was in is dated February 11. It was dropped in a mailbox right across the street from the White House so they can make sure that it got there, and then was sent on to Shriver, the man who just died recently. The founding director of the Peace Corps, died about a week ago. Was buried a few days ago. Off in the corner there, I'm going to go away from the microphone, but I think my voice is probably loud enough. Over here, this is Shriver's handwriting, and he says, C, and then he circled C. Knopfsinger, see if Knopfsinger could come over tomorrow, set appointment. Shriver is telling his assistant that get this man over here. I want to talk to this guy, because in his letter, Knopfsinger is saying how they recruited volunteers, how they trained them, what they were looking for, how they found assignments, how they sent them out, and all of this good stuff. How am I doing on time, Gary? I'm okay? Okay. They didn't meet the next day. They took about 3 or 4 days to meet. But, after their meeting, it was decided that they should work together. And over time, over the next few months, they've worked together actually quite a bit. I've got a couple of quotations, and if I can go through my notes and find them, I've got them. Now I've got to get my glasses so I'm not blind as a bat. In May 1961, this is from the archives for the IVS, that is International Voluntary Services. Knopfsinger is still with them. He wrote to one of his staff people about the new Peace Corps folks. He says, there seems to be a heavy fog hanging over their entire program. We are usually invited to sit in on some of their conferences, or some of their committee come over to the IVS office as much as 2 or 3 times each week to learn how IVS recruits, screens, etc., gets money out to its people in the bush, and pays and selects leaders, etc. Earlier, Shriver wrote to a man named John T. O'Rourke, who was editor of the Washington Daily News, saying, Dr. Knopfsinger was one of the first people we consulted when we began the study of Peace Corps programs and policies. His counsel was most valuable. He has continued to meet with us from time to time, and we've benefited greatly from his advice, which I am sure we shall continue to solicit in the months ahead. In fact, Peace Corps did. On August 31, 1961, Knopfsinger said goodbye to IVS. I've got to retire. The next day, September 1, he was on Shriver's staff. And they gave him an office of public affairs, gave him a title of special counselor in the diplomatic corps. So today his grave is in Rock Creek Park Cemetery in Washington, D.C. in the diplomatic section. Here he is in 1963. Here he is at a staff meeting. Shriver would have morning staff meetings on different programs. This man was important for Shriver for another reason that some of the people who might be a little bit older in this audience might remember. One thing about the 1960 campaign that the Republican opponents were using against Kennedy was his religion. He's a Catholic. We're going to vote the Pope into the White House. Well, here's a guy who came from the peace churches. And one of the things that Peace Corps did in its first years was to try to get up linkages with non-government organizations. So they worked with CARE, for example, and developed a number of programs in Africa and such. And they had a lot of religious organizations that wanted to work with Peace Corps. And they had a kind of tier categorization of groups they work with and definitely you won't work with. So you don't really want to work with Catholic Relief because yes, they will give out good stuff, but they'll also slip in a Bible. So, even though the IVS had been set up by the peace churches, it was absolutely non-sectarian. It did no proselytization, and if anybody did, they sent them home. So you had Shriver used Knopfsinger as kind of his buffer to keep himself separate. He wanted to work with organizations, but was very leery of the religious connection that might come up. So when we think here on the 50th anniversary of Peace Corps, yes, it was a political thing for Kennedy. He wanted to win the White House. More than he wanted the Peace Corps, actually. He didn't give a fig about it. He had his brother-in-law do it. But it was based on more than just an election gimmick. It was based on a tradition within the American past that Knopfsinger represented and served as a conduit through time. And how often do we historians find that? My God, almost never. Here's a direct link from a colonial past in 1901, 1910, all the way through the Cold War on into the new century. And here's the man who linked it up. And when my friend Bob Minnick told me about him, I could have kissed Bob. Would have surprised both of us. Anyway, that's my little talk. Thank you so very much.
Well, we've had three really excellent presentations this evening. I know Dr. Isaacs would be pleased, and I want you to keep him in your thoughts, him and his wife Doris. We have a few minutes. If anybody has a question you'd like to direct to any or all of the presenters tonight, does anybody have a question you want to ask? Okay, well, thank you very much for being here. And I presume somebody's ended up with those sign-up sheets. I'll take those before you get away from here.